Welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast by Third Wave. Today, I am speaking with Manesh Girn, the psychedelic scientist.
You can't just focus on a single network in understanding psychedelics' effects on the brain. Psychedelics fundamentally affect the way the entire brain functions, and they affect a variety of networks beyond the default mode network. And so one way to kind of in a more nuanced fashion relate the brain to psychedelic effects is to ask the question, how do psychedelics change fundamental ways that the brain processes information?
Hey listeners, I am so excited to have Manesh Girn on the podcast today. We talk about brain coherence and how complex systems, complex science applies to the basically application of psychedelics within the brain. So as many of us know, the default mode network, the DMN, is the most commonly talked about phrase or term as it relates to why psychedelics are helpful and impactful on brain. We hear things like, by interrupting the default mode network, we become more present, we step out of rigidity, we step out of stories, et cetera, et cetera. We brought Manesh on today to talk about the most recent context on psychedelic neuroscience and talk about, while the DMN is a great model, the impact of psychedelics on brain action is so much more complex than just the default mode network. So we get a little technical, but as always, I managed to bring the conversation back into understandable terms for you. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode on psychedelics and brain action. Manesh Girn is a psychedelic neuroscientist with feet in both academic and industry. His interest in psychedelics has led him to develop extensive expertise on the neurobiology and psychology of these substances, and he applies this knowledge as both the chief research officer at Entheotech Bioscience and also as part of his process of obtaining his Ph.D. in neuroscience at McGill University. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Manesh Girn, the psychedelic scientist. Hey listeners, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. Today we have Manesh Girn, the psychedelic scientist. Manesh, welcome to the show. It's good to have you on.
Thanks, Paul. Super excited to talk with you.
Let's talk about your YouTube channel to start off with. I think that's how I first heard about your work, through a mutual friend of ours, Nick Vasev. You started a YouTube channel, I think almost 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago now, called The Psychedelic Scientist, which I love. It's bold. It's quite the claim. And you've done a lot of work and research in this space. So I'd love just to hear sort of the origin story about why start a YouTube channel talking about psychedelic neuroscience.
Yeah, definitely. So psychedelics have been an interest of mine for a long time, and it's been interesting to see them emerge as such a popular topic in the past few years, really. And I, looking at the media landscape and the type of reporting that was out there, it's like obvious there's a lot of sensationalist news reporting, a lot of simplistic narratives taking hold, and like a lot of things that scientists working in the field would kind of cringe at, and this is still the case. And so this was during the pandemic as well. I found myself with extra time, and I was like, why don't I just use some of this extra time to contribute to the landscape? And so I thought about it, and originally it was going to be a written blog, but then like people don't really have attention spans these days. You need video content. And so I decided to make a YouTube channel around that, just to provide like rigorous, reliable scientific information about psychedelics that is also layperson friendly and accessible. And so that was basically the motivation there.
What is your most popular video so far that you've recorded? The one that's gotten the most views or traffic or whatever?
So I think a couple of the most popular ones. The first one, I think, is how to prepare for your trip, which is classic because people want practical information. And then another one is it was either on the neuroscience of ego dissolution or my breakdown of what ego dissolution is in terms of philosophy and also the psychology assessments that they use in research.
Okay, so that's a good lead-in. What is the neuroscience of ego dissolution?
Right, it's complex. Yeah,
There
a
we
lot of
go.
people link it. Yeah, a lot of people link it straight to the default mode network, and you hear a lot of people saying, basically equating default mode disintegration with ego dissolution, and it's really not that simple. There are studies that have shown that, yes, like a couple of them, but there are several that haven't. They just haven't found it, and then there's some that have found other correlates of ego dissolution. And so I think what I kind of mentioned in this video and I've talked about before is that we have to stop and ask ourselves, what is ego dissolution? Is it really, something we expect to have one correlate in the brain? Because what I talk about in that video is how very broadly you can even separate the experience of ego dissolution into two things, which are usually, grouped together and conflated. So one is an alteration of our sense of being located in our body, of like, this is where my arm ends and this is where the couch starts or whatever. It's like that sense of bodily representation of where we are in space physically. And then the other part of it is like our sense of identity, who we are in terms of the stories and concepts and memories. I am Manesh. I have this history in the past. This is my projected future. This is my traits. These are my traits. And in certain cases, you can be totally dissolved physically, but your mind is still there. You still know who you are, right? And that could be described by some people as an ego dissolution experience. But then some other people might have an experience where they completely forget who they are. They forget all concept of reality, and they're just dissolved with everything. And they might be calling that ego dissolution experience. And so then when you try to link all this to the brain, you're linking these distinct types of experiences under one header. And so therefore, it's going to be hard to parse out something clear.
Tell us a little bit more. So the default mode network, the DMN, Robin Carhart-Harris is probably best known for popularizing this through Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. And I remember when I started a legal psilocybin retreat center a few years back. We would have a lot of people who came to that after reading Michael Pollan's book, basically saying, hey, I want to dissolve my DMN. So they had this sort of linguistic context. They were primed to think that their default mode network was the thing that was actually responsible for their challenges, their issues, their stuckness, their stagnation, whatever it is. So I'd love for you to just further flesh that out, because I think as part of this conversation, what we're going to do is sort of poke holes in that hypothesis that the DMN is sort of the predominant way of, or the predominant model of perceiving ego dissolution in psychedelic experiences. But before we can do that, we just need to better understand, what is the default mode network? Why is it relevant? And from your lens, from your perspective, why did it become sort of the most widely talked about model for psychedelic neuroscience?
Yeah, totally. So we'll start with what is the default mode network. And broadly speaking, if we start from the basics, if you understand the brain, you can understand it as a set of different brain regions which interact. And then subsets of those regions interact more with each other than with the rest of the brain, and we call those distinct networks. Now, in a very popular kind of way of separating the brain into networks, there are 7 networks. One of them is like the visual network. One is somatomotor, related to our sense of touch and our motor commands, our movement. And then one of these is the default mode network. And the thing with the default mode network is it's actually composed of regions that span a lot of the brain. It's not just located in one spot. And these are parts of the brain that are the most developed in humans compared to primates. So they're arguably the regions that make us uniquely human. And related to that, as you would expect, therefore, they're related in a lot of cognitive processes and aspects of our experience that are that differentiate us from other animals. For example, us humans, we seem to have a pretty unique ability to be able to abstract from the present moment and think about things that are not here. We're able to kind of extricate us from the limitations of our immediate sensory inputs. And the research tells us this is what the default mode network fundamentally does. It's an abstraction network that allows us to draw on internal representation, stored knowledge in terms of experience and concepts, to think about things that are not here, and also recombine those things in new ways, as in imagination or future planning. And so the default mode network as a whole is this advanced network that allows these processes. And under its rubric are also our ability to conceptualize ourselves and create a story about who we are. This is where the link to ego dissolution comes from, because it's involved in our sense of self in terms of it's the narrative around who we are, or what researchers sometimes call our autobiographical self, again, rooted in memory. And it's also related to our ability to think about the minds of other people. And it's very involved in our social cognition, our ability to all the thinking that's involved in social interaction. And people don't really know this, but if you're watching a movie, default mode network is highly involved with that, and it's connecting to our visual networks, because we're seeing the movie, but then we're not just watching lights on a screen. We're giving it meaning and structure and applying frameworks to it. And this application of frameworks to perception is mediated by the default mode network. So again, it can even take it a bit more broadly. Whenever we're using our internal frameworks or knowledge to interact with the world or think internally in terms of daydreaming, the default mode network is engaged. And so psychedelics. So where this emerged with psychedelics was initially with the 2012 paper, which was the first ever paper that used fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to look at psilocybin. This was done by Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London. And so you can imagine they gave people some psilocybin and they put them in these brain scanners, and you would expect the whole brain's going to light up, it's going to do crazy things because the psychedelic experience is so complex. What they actually found was there were only deactivations, and these were specifically in the default mode network. And then immediately they're like, oh, this makes so much sense. It's turning off our conceptual filters, the things that limit our experience. And it aligns with like Aldous Huxley and others talking about this reducing valve, how the brain, rather than creating our experience of the world, is limiting and filtering the information it's receiving to make it manageable for us. And so it really aligned with all these intuitions and things. And they also found a correlation between things in the default mode network and ego dissolution in that data set. And so that inspired people's imaginations because it just made so much intuitive sense. And then what people don't realize is that when the 2016 paper with LSD came out, which is 4 years later, using the same methods but for LSD, they didn't find the same deactivations in the default mode network. There were some correlations with ego dissolution in the default mode network, but like the whole concept of the brain becoming more deactivated wasn't there as much. And then a more complex picture started to emerge that researchers were turned on to, but still the public were still stuck on the default mode network story. And then when Michael Pollan's book came out, I'm not sure, I don't remember when it exactly came out, maybe 2016 or around
2018. It was May 2018.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, 2018. Then he kind of put that into that book, and that turned a lot of people onto psychedelics, and it just kind of grew into this dogma almost like, yeah, D-man equals ego dissolution. And but the reality is now any researcher, and Robin Carhart-Harris himself, like we've chatted about it many times, are no longer on board with that idea. It's just the default mode network. We recognize it's much more complex. Psychedelics affect the whole brain. You can't reduce it to a single network. And there have been several studies which specifically looked at ego dissolution and the default mode network and did not find an association. So it's nowhere near unequivocal.
So my understanding, just to reflect some of this, of the default mode network, when we talk about its kind of the role that it plays in psychedelic healing, is that these clinical conditions, for lack of a better term, depression, addiction, OCD, anxiety, when individuals are struggling with these issues, their default mode network is a lot more rigid, so to say. So there's a rigidity that is present. There's a sort of a calcification, if you will. And what psychedelics do is they interrupt that process to create space. So there's more, let's say, flexibility and plasticity. So that way, these default patterns that we always find ourselves in aren't necessarily the choices that we make after a psychedelic experience. So the best known metaphor is Mendel's metaphor that was amplified in Michael Pollan's book. You know, Mendel made the point that in the brain, with these sort of grooves, we're used to following them, and then we have this fresh thing of snow that comes down, and now all of a sudden we can make new grooves in our brain. And I sense even as I'm talking about this, there is a intermingling of maybe technical terms, because even this sort of new grooves may or may not have something to do with the default mode network. But my whole point in saying this is the default mode network, as you emphasize, is not a bad thing. Just like the ego is not a bad thing. It simply is a thing that allows us to exist in reality. And the impact that psychedelics have on the default mode network, or the ego, or whatever it is, can be beneficial, but also it goes well beyond the default mode network. And so I'd love for you to further expand on that, right? So this comes down to a recent paper that you published, which if you want to talk through that in detail, you're more than welcome to. But talk about some of the other systems or networks or models that neuroscientists are exploring when it comes to the efficacy in psychedelics for healing, for transformation, maybe not even specifically ego dissolution, but just generally what's happening in the brain when we work with psychedelics and why are they helpful for us as humans?
Yes, definitely. And first, I want to quickly speak to this whole thing, about the DMN's, the deep hormone network, centrality across mental health disorders, and this idea of shaking the snow globe, or putting a fresh layer of snow on the grooves to allow for new states. A lot of that is honestly speculative storytelling, and stories that are useful in a practical, pragmatic sense, but not necessarily fully validated scientifically. And so then we get into like that leads into a whole discussion on the ultimate utility of these findings. It's like, for example, if somebody's able to use those metaphors and believe that that's what happens in the brain, that could be very helpful for them for their healing process, even though strictly speaking, it might not be quote unquote objectively true. And then it's okay. So how are we leveraging these ostensible scientific facts, right? But it is the case that the deep hormone network is implicated in a variety of disorders. And it relates to our kind of spontaneous thinking, the thinking we engage in on a day-to-day basis all the time, mind wandering. And so the idea is, if you perturb the functioning of it, if you break it out of its usual patterns, then you're escaping out of those usual patterns of thought, which might be more rigid and stuck into little ruts, which, hence rumination or OCD, etc. And so that all makes...
It sounds nice, right? Like it sounds like it's clean, it's tight, it's coherent, there's a good story behind it, it's easy to talk about. But what you're saying is science is never necessarily that simple, and a lot of these assumptions are not necessarily validated by science, by clinical trials or fMRIs or whatever else.
Yeah, totally. Anyway, the answer is always we don't know enough. It's more complex. That's science. So if we come back to my paper, then this paper was recently published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, and the name of the paper is A Complex Systems Perspective on Psychedelic Brain Action. And it goes straight in line with what we've been discussing in this concept that you can't just focus on a single network in understanding understanding psychedelics' effects on the brain. Psychedelics fundamentally affect the way the entire brain functions, and they affect a variety of networks beyond the deep hormone network. And so one way to kind of in a more nuanced fashion relate the brain to psychedelic effects is to ask the question of how do psychedelics change fundamental ways that the brain processes information? Because intuitively, it makes sense that that's what happens. You'll be in the same environment, the same light will be hitting your retina, but how it's being processed is radically different. You'll be hearing things from people, but the way that perceptual input is received by your system is radically different, and the way you think about it is radically different. And so it doesn't really make sense in my mind to even ask what is the one brain state or one region or network that does that. It's like, how is the whole brain dynamically changing its activity over time in interaction with the external environment, whether it's people or like physical objects. And so so this paper was motivated by those ideas on how to expand beyond this localized approach, but also the recognition that a lot of brain imaging research with psychedelics so far has a lot of inconsistencies. Like, sure, reduced connectivity within the deep hormone network, whatever it means ultimately, is a pretty consistent finding. And so you do see that in most studies, or basically all studies with psychedelics. But beyond that, there's a lot of inconsistencies. If you look at the other networks and how they interact, sometimes you'll get stronger effects in certain networks related to attention and how they interact with other networks, sometimes more in motor networks, sometimes more in this network. And it's with the same drug, and when scanned by different research groups, they're finding different things. And so it's like, why is it so different? Is it just impossible to get something consistent with psychedelics? Is there something fundamentally wrong with fMRI? How can we reconcile these inconsistencies? And what really drew my attention to how strong these inconsistencies were was when I was looking in detail at individual people. Because when you see these studies, you're looking at averages of anywhere from 10 to 30 or more people. But as we know, everyone responds to a psychedelic very differently psychologically. So you would assume that in their brain, it's not going to be the same thing. This wouldn't make sense if we assume that the brain and mind are interlinked, which they seem to be. And so then looking at individual people had radically different responses. sometimes opposite responses. So I was like, okay, how do we make sense of this? So then with this model, we were drawing on something called complexity science. And so complexity science is a way of understanding any system of interacting parts, and usually that dynamically changes over time. So, for example, an ecosystem, let's say a forest, in order for that ecosystem to be in equilibrium, the jaguars need to eat the rodents, and the eagles have to attack the jaguars, and everything has its role in place. And if you take out the jaguars, the mouse population will proliferate and they'll destroy the plants, and then the animals that eat the plants will get messed up in their diet. You see how everything's an interconnected whole. And so in this paper, we're applying that same kind of thinking to the brain. It's like every brain region plays a role, but in synergistic interaction and complementary interaction with each other. And so if you perturb one part of the brain, it's going to propagate throughout the brain. So how can we understand this propagation? And so we drew on a whole bunch of fMRI findings, and also findings about how the brain functions independent of psychedelics, to make the argument that psychedelics, what they're doing is inducing a different state of whole brain functioning. They're changing the way the entire ecology functions of the brain. And in particular, it's making the whole ecology, making the whole brain more integrated. So information is able to propagate throughout the network more easily. It's making it more flexible. So its patterns of interaction change more over time. And it's making it more adaptive and sensitive to inputs that come in. So if the ecology of the brain is receiving an input, let's say, information into the eyes or verbal information, it's much more sensitive to it. It's able to incorporate it into its functioning in a much more sensitive way, such that it's able to respond many different ways in response to the same stimulus. So there's a greater flexibility and adaptivity of response to stimuli. And that this kind of change in functioning, depending on what stimuli it's receiving, is going to manifest very differently. And, if the brain is processing information differently in a fundamental way, where the brain is going to go is dependent on the interaction between the information it's receiving and that new mode of functioning. And so for one person, you might take a psychedelic in one particular environment, and given their past psychological history, their traits, all these things are encoded in the brain, and that's going to interact with the drug as well as the inputs you're taking in environmentally, and send you along a different, you could say, trajectory or path of states in the brain and mental states. And that's your unique psychedelic journey. Somebody else in the same context can have a very different experience because their brain's different or they're in a different environment. And so this framework tells us how the psychedelic effects are more abstract. They affect the way the brain processes information, and the way that goes can be very different for different people. And this is actually consistent with several findings in the field as well.
Okay, so I want to do my best to land this. So what I'm hearing, and correct me within this, because I think it'll be helpful for listener understanding as well, is the brain, when working with psychedelics, will be impacted differently depending on the type of psychedelic, depending on the environment in which you are taking that psychedelic, depending on the amount of psychedelic that you are doing. Depending on one's trauma, path, history, in terms of what's already been encoded in the brain. And I love the metaphor of like ecology, that our brain is interconnected, all, like you said, complex systems, complex science, all of these things are working together. And that when we do a psychedelic, it activates certain parts of the brain that helps to facilitate greater coherence between all elements of the brain, which means the way that I feel is I feel more centered, I feel more present, I maybe feel outside of time, I'm not as stuck in stories of the past or stories of the future. And I'd love, potentially, I'm now extrapolating kind of from what you're talking about, and I would love for you to maybe discuss a little bit about like what parts of the brain are usually not that activated, that become activated through psychedelic use, that lead to some level of healing, some level of insight, For example, is it the prefrontal cortex? Is it the hippocampus? Is it the cerebellum? Is it kind of what's going on from that lens and that perspective in terms of these different physiological parts of the actual brain?
Yes, for sure. First, I want to say that, although, yes, this change in function can translate into a more balanced, centered state that's conducive for healing. As we both know, it doesn't have to be that. It's not necessarily going to be that. And I think it depends on the inputs you're receiving and all these things I was telling, which is going to interact with the effects.
For sure.
And so the whole thing about set and setting and proper prep and all these things is to be able to kind of control what inputs, what information is interacting with the drug to produce a particular experience. And so if you feel safe, ready to surrender with close friends, no surprises, no crazy things going around you, that's creating a set of information or stimuli or inputs which interact with the drug to produce a positive experience, right? So that's an important part. Like, I think what I want to emphasize with this paper is that it's neutral. It's changing the way the brain functions. If you put in garbage is going to come out. If you put in good things, you're more likely to have good things come out. And in terms of specific regions, so I'm kind of hesitant to answer that because I think even there's a movement towards conceptualizing things like depression and other disorders as whole brain phenomena, right? It's like, what is their brain as a whole doing differently? Because again, it's like if you were to quote unquote or disintegrate the default mode network, that's going to have ramifications throughout the brain. It's like, okay, so then can you really just look at the default mode network and ignore what's happening in the rest? And there's this movement in psychiatry, it's biological psychiatry is all the rage these days. So they're trying to find what are the biomarkers associated with different disorders, right? And so usually that's in terms of training a machine learning classifier on people's whole brain and doing it for like hundreds or like over 1,000 people. And then that classifier will find regions or networks across the entire brain and different patterns of them and how they relate to different subtypes or types of a given disorder. And so, for example, one subtype might be focused on the default mode network. One subtype might be more focused on attention networks. And then you can make the argument that what each of those people need might be different because their depression or whatever is taking a radically different manifestation in their brain. And so I think, similarly, psychedelics are going to, affect different regions more for different people. And that's going to have relevance for different disorders in a more of an individual specific way. So I think what's interesting here is the movement towards more of a precision medicine approach where we look in more detail at an individual person. What's their unique brain like? What's their unique presentation of something like depression in their brain? And how can we make inferences about, for example, which psychedelic or which environment might be better for them based on an idea of what psychedelic-induced brain states will counter the pathophysiology brain states of depression, like the negative brain states associated with that. And for some people, maybe you need more prefrontal cortex connectivity with other regions, with the amygdala, what have you, in order to increase your ability to regulate their emotions or regulate their thought stream. Or for someone else, it might be, related to their insula, which is a region involved in your body awareness and connectivity with your bodily signals. Maybe it needs to be more somatic for them. Or it could be really anything. And so I think what regions are most important in terms of your experience and also clinically is going to be different based on the person. But again, it's like you have to take into account the whole brain context to make these inferences.
Now, what comes up as you're talking about this is neurofeedback. So I have done some neurofeedback. I've worked with a practitioner out here in San Diego who's a world-class practitioner. He did a brain scan prior to the neurofeedback, identified certain parts of my brain that maybe weren't as hooked up or connected, kind of showed it to me on a map, said, okay, now with neurofeedback, we're going to tie these together and create greater connectivity between these two. And then we did, I think, 3 days of neurofeedback with some sort of core intentions. And what I found to be true with neurofeedback is neurofeedback felt much more, it felt like a precision modality. In other words, it felt like sort of my brain was an instrument and we were going in with neurofeedback and we were tuning the brain to facilitate different states. And whenever I would talk about my experience with neurofeedback, I would compare it with psychedelics, where psychedelics felt more like a volcano. They felt more like it was catalytic, where there was
Right.
less of a capacity to be precise about the application of that for certain indications. And so I'm curious, from your lens, how can we make psychedelics more precise in this way? What needs to happen? What research has to be done? Because I just feel like there's a gap right now, right? Like, it's like I can smoke 5-MeO DMT, and even the same friend of mine, he did brain scans with another friend before and after 5-MeO, and it was incredible what 5-MeO did in terms of what it activated and what it opened up. But there wasn't any sort of precision, like, okay, now you smoke the 5-MeO, and we're gonna know that it's gonna do X, Y, and Z. There wasn't that ability necessarily, and so I'm curious from your lens. I know this probably has something to do with the type of medicine. This probably has something to do with the amount of medicine. And this also has something to do, obviously, with the set and setting and when you're doing it. But I'd just be curious, kind of from your lens, like, how could we make psychedelics more precise as medicines for the brain?
Yes. Yeah, it's a great question. And one interesting thing here, because you mentioned 5-MeO, is that 5-MeO actually works very differently than things like psilocybin or NN-DMT or LSD, in that it mainly works through the serotonin 1A receptor rather than the 2A. And the thing is, the 1A is more predominantly located in a different set of regions, such as actually the hippocampus and stress and memory-related regions. And so the neuroplasticity boosts through 5-MeO seem to be predominantly located in different areas than the other psychedelics, and that would have ramifications for
which is interesting because it's a tryptamine still. So the assumption would be that it would be similar to NN-DMT because it's a tryptamine, or that it would be. Why is it different? Any sort of insight into that?
Yeah, it's hard to know unless maybe certain chemists might know the relationship between the chemical structure and what receptors. But for whatever reason, it's like quite differently. Whereas the other ones, like psilocybin or NN-DMT, you give a serotonin 2A receptor blocker, you're basically blocking all the effects. Not necessarily the case with 5-MeO. There seem to be, well, to make it sound as intense as it is, the affinity of 5-MeO for serotonin 1A, so like how much it is drawn to it compared to 2A, is somewhere around 300 to 1,000 times more. So it really goes there. And you only get strong serotonin 2A receptor activation at higher doses of 5-MeO. So you still get it. It just takes more. And again, this has ramifications for neuroplasticity that we really just don't even know yet, because the research is still in its infancy, and especially with 5-MeO, there's not that much neuroplasticity research actually specifically with that. So in terms of how to make psychedelics more precise, I think it's really about, one, understanding more about where these drugs, kind of the selective differences in what regions these different drugs target neuroplasticity-wise, for example. And then also really just on the therapeutic support side, it's like right now it's the Wild West in terms of what is the, therapy in psychedelic assisted therapy. Some people say, oh, CBT is the way to go, or ACT, or somatic therapy, or you just gotta, shut up and let the inner healer do it all. And so it's unclear on which one is ideal, if we can even say one is ideal or the best, or which ones are better for specific applications. People have their own intuitive understanding of that, and a lot of practitioners who have been doing it for many decades or what have you have an idea of that. But in terms of the literature and scientific kind of medical context, we really don't know. And so I think in order to try to make more specific targeted interventions with psychedelics, it needs to be informed by a greater degree of knowledge on the neuropharmacology side, but then also in terms of the interaction between different therapeutic frameworks and the effects of psychedelics, and what interventions should be coupled with it. And also what environments, like we haven't even looked at the efficacy of taking psilocybin in a forest versus in the standard, comfortable living room type environment. We don't even know that yet. We don't even know the effects of set and setting, really. It's just assumed since Leary that that's a thing. And we assume somewhat that our medicalized lying on the couch with two therapists is the best way, but maybe at the beach for some people, maybe in a forest, maybe wherever. Yeah, so a lot of the times it's a very shotgun approach with psychedelics, as you're saying. It's like, I heard this analogy, or whatever it is, if it's not an analogy, recently, of shooting a cannon at a rabbit, right? It's like kind of blasting the whole thing in order to try to get something might be a bit more specific. and that's just what we have right now. But with everything I just described, or even the creation of second, third generation psychedelics, which are somehow more targeted as well, might be the way to go. But all this stuff is years away. I think we're still really in the early stages exploring this stuff.
Yeah, and in some ways, I've been hosting this podcast for 6.5 years, and have been talking about personalized medicine for about that length of time, right? So it's always been a thought, an idea, something that's on the cutting edge, something that we feel like we're on the precipice of leaning into. And yet still here in 2023, the vast majority of people don't necessarily have access to what we would consider personalized medicine. A lot of it, what I've found, comes down to intuition and mentorship. So in other words, like if I've done X, Y, and Z, and I have a friend or a colleague or whoever who reaches out to me and they give me a little bit of context and background about their story, then I might be able to make a recommendation based on that. I mean, it's why we at Third Wave are investing so much in our training program for coaches, because there's a lot of, I think, insight and wisdom that just can't yet be captured by modern technology, because it's simply not accessible to the degree that we would want it accessible for. Because not only is it a matter of, okay, everyone could, like, it'd be so cool if there was a technology that made it easy where I could go on Amazon, I could buy a brain scanning tool for $100. I could scan my brain every morning to see how it's changing. And then, based on that scan, I could submit it to a coach and they would tell me, okay, take this microdose or take this psychedelic. Maybe I also submit my Aura Ring data and they go, okay,
Yeah.
I'm seeing sleep here. I see. But the interpretation of that data itself is quite difficult anyway. So training and education and bringing all the people into this is quite a lift. So for the time being, my sense is this, like, for any listeners who are at home, who are joining us, kind of having an intuitive sense of where you're at, talking with people that you trust who have maybe walked that path before you, and then simply experimenting to some degree with different medicines, with different amounts of medicines, always ideally with the support of either a trained therapist, a coach, or at least a good friend. Feels like, like you said, we're still in the Wild West to some degree. And I'm not sure, because of all the bureaucracy, because of all the red tape, I'm not sure when that inflection point will hit. I feel like we've been building up to it. But we haven't reached that inflection point where all of a sudden this personalized approach is widely accessible and people can easily utilize it. I know it will happen at some point. It just continues to be unclear as to when that might be the case. I mean, any thoughts on that? I know one thing I was going to mention is you're joining Robin Carhart-Harris as a postdoc. He's working with Adam Ghazali, who we've had on the podcast before. Adam is sort of attempting to pioneer a lot of these things. When you think about precision medicine, when you think about neuroscience, when you're looking at the research, where are we at in that process? Are we actually reasonably close? Does it feel like we're potentially many years off? What are sort of your thoughts on this whole precision medicine, neuroscience, psychedelic overlap?
Yes, for sure. I think the main issue with psychedelics is the cost of collecting data. So for precision medicine, and to be able to predict based on, let's say, a combination of biometrics and neuroimaging and psychological measures, if we bring all that together and try to predict what drug they need or what treatment is better for them, etc., essentially at the end of the day need these machine learning models, right? You need algorithms which are able to take all that data and parse out some structure and map that onto things you want to map it onto. And that requires lots of data, like probably thousands of people to make it accurate, usually. Because mental health is so complex, it takes various forms, etc. And so the thing with psychedelics is it's so costly to have somebody take psilocybin, then you have to look after them for 6 to 8 hours, and then you pay for a therapist time, you pay for a physician time, you pay for the technology. That adds up, and scale that to 100 people, it's already like a lot of money. Then you need thousands. It's kind of crazy, especially when federal funding and these things are starting to trickle in for psychedelics, but historically they haven't been there this last decade. And so data is a major thing there. But I think there's a lot of promise in the precision medicine, as you're saying. We just need better models and more data. And, partially what they're doing at Neuroscape, which is where I'll be working with Robin and also Adam, is trying to incorporate more of these multimodal biometrics and seeing how they change with psychedelics to get a sense of how they're affecting more basic things like heart rate variability, like our sleep patterns, and a variety of other like physiological metrics and how they relate to the psychological ones, and etc. The ideal, I think, right now, and this is kind of what some of the projects are aimed at. You want to be able to know based on baseline or immediately after their first experience, what's their likelihood this is going to be a long-term benefit. Is it more likely they're going to need another experience in 3 weeks, in a month, in 6 months, and all these other different concerns that they might have of, is it safe for this person to go off their medication or not? And are they showing markers suggestive of a strong relapse into suicidal ideation? And I think, the more data we collect and the more multimodal it is, spanning psychology, the brain, and also physiology, the more accurate our models will be. And we're definitely moving towards that. But as you said, we've been moving towards that for quite some time. And I think, good quality, reliable data is largely the bottleneck.
Yeah, and I like I said, I sense we're building up. There's a lot of building. There's a lot of building. There's clearly, people who are at the cutting edge. There's early pioneers. I would consider myself to be one of them. I think I would consider you to be one of them as well. But we haven't yet reached a point where it, has hit that inflection point, and all of a sudden we all have Oura rings and we're all getting blood tests and we're all doing our own brain scans and, looking at how we dial in. I think that has to be the future of medicine, that sort of decentralized, democratized, accessible approach. So people can really own their own data. They can own their own choices and decisions and see what the actual impact of those choices and decisions are. But right now, the vast majority of people are not anywhere near sort of getting behind this. Slight transition, although you were just touching on this. Robin Carhart-Harris, right? Robin's one of probably the most prominent psychedelic neuroscientist currently alive today. I think last year or the year before, he was mentioned in Time's top 100 people to watch. He was at Imperial for a very long time. He was one of the original Three Musketeers with Ben Sessa and David Nutt. And he is now at UCSF with the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Fellowship Professorship or something like that with Adam Ghazali, and they're doing some really dope shit. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Robin and why you are choosing to join him as a postdoc at UCSF.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been collaborating and working with Robin since around 2017, something like this. And me as a young researcher, obviously I saw his papers in the news and the media. I'm like, oh, how can I get linked to this guy? And he's kind of this figure who's way up there. Everyone, puts him on a pedestal, etc. And back in around then, 2017, I came up with an idea to analyze some of their LSD data in relation to creativity and in relation to research I had been doing at the University of British Columbia in a cognitive neuroscience lab. And long story short, I ended up publishing a paper on a partial kind of experimental paper on psychedelics and creativity. And that came out in 2018, I believe. And that forged the kind of collaborative relationship between me and Robin. And since then, we've published, we've been on 3 other additional papers together, including the one I was talking about before. He's on that paper. A lot of those ideas were born out of discussions I had with Robin over Zoom, etc. And so now, we talk quite often and get along very well. He's like a wonderful, humble, easygoing person, and obviously very, very knowledgeable, and has been at the forefront of this stuff for over a decade. Obviously, his whole career is him playing the role of a pioneer and giving the credibility to psychedelics and neuroscience and science. And so he's played a huge role. And so, when I was 20 years old, it's like, oh, I want to work with this guy. This guy did the first study with psilocybin, and he's, it was a little bit before he did his LSD one. And so anyway, then when it came to finishing up my PhD, which I'm doing now, I'll graduate in a couple months with it. And it was like a no-brainer, like, Robin, I'm going to work with you. And originally I was going to go to London to work with him there. Then he went to San Francisco. It's like, even better, because I'm from Vancouver. I'm a West Coaster for sure. And, just a few hour flight from where I grew up. And San Francisco's, beautiful, lots of stuff going on, better weather than Canada and London for that matter. And I'm just really excited to go down there because not only working with Robin and Adam, the whole environment there is so interdisciplinary. You got Berkeley, and also like interinstitutional. You got Berkeley nearby, you got Stanford nearby. Got a lot of people interested in psychedelics and related topics. The whole biohacking world, the tech world, obviously Silicon Valley and all these kind of things. It just seems like the perfect environment to do rich, impactful research. And so, I knew the opportunity was there to work with Robin, and of course I took it. And so, yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing. And with him, what I'm personally going to be focusing on is diving deeper into how psychedelics alter our sense of self and our beliefs about ourselves and how we process information related to ourselves. And this theme of the self is a major theme in the world these days and across mental health. And a lot of speakers, thinkers, visionaries often emphasize how our kind of individualized society and our sense of separateness from each other is at the core root of a lot of problems we're facing, at a civilization level, disconnection from the environment, from each other, in-group, out-group mentalities, and dehumanizing others for various traits, and this whole myself at all costs mentality. And so with psychedelics, we all know they induce these can induce quote unquote mystical type experiences and feelings of connectedness and connection to others and universe and whatever you want to call it. And these are seem to be related to people getting better from things like depression. And so, but the thing is, the manner in which psychedelics affect our beliefs about ourselves and how we process self-related information and how we conceptualize ourselves is in its infancy. There's a lot of research outside of psychedelics looking at it in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, but that research is so independent and siloed off from psychedelics. In psychedelic realm, we have our concept of ego dissolution, we have our concept of mystical experience, but we're not intersecting nearly as much as we could be with the existing literatures in these other areas related to self and self-related processing, etc. And so with Robin, I want to help create those bridges to enrich both the study of our sense of self and self-experience and self-related processing and self-beliefs, that literature itself, but also how psychedelics alter these things in a more empirically sophisticated and rigorous way, to basically understand at a deeper level how and to what extent are psychedelics making these changes for people.
And so what are some of the core hypotheses that you want to explore as part of that?
So definitely. So on the basic level, we think that, I think that with psychedelic use, we start to hold our beliefs about ourselves less strongly in a general way. We're less likely to cling to this is who I am, this is what I'm like. And the corollary is this is what the world is like. This is how things are. I feel like psychedelics can induce a kind of epistemic humility where we're like, oh, we don't really know what's going on. Who I think I am and how I identify is just a construction created by my mind that is going to change and is changing. And therefore, there's no concrete basis for saying who I am fundamentally beyond saying something like, you're, I don't know, the universe or the ground of all experience or whatever. And so I hypothesize that people will hold their self-identity less tightly and that the effects will be strongest for negative beliefs, where psychedelics can promote greater self-compassion, greater other compassion, and reduce the strength of these negative beliefs we have about ourselves. And there's already some empirical evidence suggesting that negative beliefs in particular are reduced under psychedelics. But I want to go further and see how does that relate to how the brain processes information. And to make this all concrete, here's an example of how to test it. We could, for example, let's say I gave you 5 different little short stories and then asked you to imagine yourself as somebody in that story and then reflect on or choose from a list of 20 beliefs, what thoughts and beliefs about yourself would emerge in this context and how would you feel about it? And then also you can look at how their brain's responding to this kind of thing. So let's say one story, let's say, I had been in a marriage for 30 years. You go on a vacation by yourself. You come home and you notice your room smells like somebody else's cologne or perfume or something's off. There's some kind of ambiguous thing that happened that could be triggering if you're feeling insecure or uncertain. And then, so we'll have that story laid out. It's like, imagine you're this person. How would you feel? And then, you could choose and say, I feel like, the belief that, I'm not really worthy of this person. They chose somebody else, or I'm not really worthy of love, or I'm not enough, or
I'd be fucking pissed off. That's
right.
I'd be angry. probably more
Right,
than
right.
anything.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. What emotions are you feeling? Are you feeling hurt and sad, or angry and resentful? Right.
Right.
So all these things combined, and then, that one's a bit clear. Like, you'd probably be pissed off and suspicious, but like the whole point is making them very ambiguous. So you
Right.
could interpret it in a more charitable way,
Sure.
but you can also interpret it in a more taking it personally and maybe almost insecure kind of way. Do you know what
Sure.
I mean? And as a way to tease out what are their beliefs, because you can ask people what your beliefs are, but it's more accurate to tease them out, because then they can't really hide them and try to appear a particular way. And so kind of getting them to do something like that before and after a psychedelic experience, maybe even during, under a certain dosage, to see how are these things shifting for people. And then correlating that with, you can do biometrics, you can do brain changes, you can do other psychological measures, you can do depression scores. And just seeing how does all this stuff hang together, and how could that help inform how psychedelics are working at a deeper level.
One thing that I've always thought to be true about psychedelics, which is reflected in Terence McKenna and the first book that he wrote, which was not Food of the Gods, nor was it True Hallucinations, but the first book that he wrote was The Archaic Revival. And so what I've always been interested in is, how do psychedelics help us in terms of this sense of self? How do they help us to identify with this sort of ancient sense of self, a self that is potentially tens of thousands of years old, a self that is beyond modernity and beyond sort of the distraction and noise of 21st century life, to really slow down and get back into what has made us human. One of my other favorite authors and a good friend is Douglas Rushkoff. He wrote this book, Team Human, because right now we're also experiencing a sort of emergence of AI and robots and, the sort of technocratic transhumanism approach. And so what I find to be most interesting about psychedelics and how they help us to perceive our sense of self is, one, this shift from atheism to spirituality. There's a lot of people, I think Michael Pollan talks about this, who are formerly identify with being an atheist, that have a mystical experience through psychedelics and now actually believe that there might be something greater out there. And another one, which is more metaphysical, is the shift from maybe a physicalist or materialist worldview to a panpsychic or idealist worldview. Does that map on at all to what you're talking about in terms of a sense of self, or is what you're talking about different or slightly different than sort of these metaphysical or conceptual things?
Yeah, it definitely intersects with them, because who we are, they construct our conception of who we are. I am an atheist. People identify with that strongly. Mm-hmm. And that actually then has an influence on how they emotionally react to things, how they interpret things, how they navigate the world. So I think those things are relevant to the extent that we take them a part of our fundamental identity. And so, our metaphysical standings and so on are related to that. But I think people who do psychedelics with an intentional mindset and are very open to it, and couple it with some kind of spiritual practice, whether it's meditation or yoga or whatever their preferred modality is, are less likely to strongly identify with any label like that, because those are just concepts. They're constructions of our mind, and I think psychedelics tell you that, and throw that in your face how they are that. And so I think it's interesting even to think about that as a studyable hypothesis, like to what extent again, I kind of said this earlier, it's like, are all of our things that we say is comprise our identity, do they all start to fall away? Do we start to just be like, oh, actually, I'm just gonna, I'm more comfortable with perpetual uncertainty about myself and the world. Like, maybe God does exist, maybe it doesn't. Maybe this is all this consciousness. Maybe it all is this inert physical matter in complex configurations that seem to give rise to life and give rise to things that are beyond the physical. And maybe we don't know any of these things, and maybe you're okay in that state of unknowing. And I think psychedelics can help with that. But it's like, one question is, what percentage of the population go that route? What predicts that? How are their brains different? And so there's so many questions on these different ways that people can go, which I think are so interesting, because I think it's fundamental. It's very relevant to each of us on our own journey and trying to understand who we are and how we make this dance between certainty and uncertainty, known and unknown, and all these things. I think it all in some way intersects with what do we identify with? Who are we? That's always the fundamental question, I think.
And that's, I think, what's so interesting about this postdoc work that you want to do with Robin is, although you're a neuroscientist, and Robin is definitely a neuroscientist. I don't consider him really to be a philosopher whatsoever. What you are exploring is starting to be philosophical, right? What is our sense of self? How does our sense of self change, evolve, grow, adapt as a result of working with psychedelics? And I think, to go back into the point that you were making earlier in the podcast, when we look at the ecology of the brain, everything is connected. And I think the same approach, the same interdisciplinary approach when we're looking at neuroscience is then what is the philosophy, what are the metaphysics that undergird the research that we are carrying out? Because as you know, as I know, as many of our listeners know, science can be corporatized or science can be bought. And so being very sort of lucid and clear and objective in terms of why are we asking the questions that we are asking, I think is just as important as the actual questions that we ask, because that metaphysical undergird will actually influence then the impact that those questions have and the impact that research has beyond just the laboratory.
Definitely. And I think for me, these things are so interconnected. Like, I think the world we live in academically is fundamentally more and more interdisciplinary, right? You can't just be a neuroscientist or be just a philosopher or just a whatever. You're intersecting with many different fields. Then you get things like neuroarchaeology or neuroanthropology or neuroarchaeoanthropology, right? And it's like you're just mixing all these different disciplines, and then we realize how artificial these distinctions are in the first place. Like, they were created perhaps as a stage of our knowledge to differentiate in order to understand, but now we're coming back to reintegration to understand the linkages. And so when I, sure, like on my trainings in neuroscience, but I read just as much into philosophy and like to ask those questions, to discuss those and see how it intersects with other disciplines. I think that's what we have to do moving forward, because again, these divisions are artificial constructions of just institutions and language. They don't necessarily point to real demarcations in the world, right? And I think this is why I love psychedelics, because they really cut across into like disciplinary divides. You need to bring in the anthropology, the religious studies, the philosophy, with the neuroscience, psychology, the psychopharmacology, and they all intersect in the most fascinating ways. And I think you can't just silo yourself off these days.
I love that. All right, there's no siloing, and maybe that's probably a great way to even wrap the podcast conversation up. There's no siloing. Everything is interconnected. The brain is interconnected. We can't just silo it to be the default mode network. There are way more complex systems that are at play that we're learning more and more about. We touched on some of those today. I remember, before we went live, I asked you, what are 3 things that we want to cover to help people realize that psychedelics go beyond just the default mode network, that we all have varied responses to psychedelics, and that psychedelics change our brain temporarily in terms of how we process things. And that depends on set and setting. That depends on the amount that we take. And that depends on all 3 of those things. And I feel like we adequately covered all of those. So to me, this has been a successful conversation and podcast. Manesh, thank you for joining us. If folks want to learn more about your work, if they want to, for example, read the research paper that we briefly talked about, just sort of point them in a general direction. And we will have links on Third Wave's website to all of this in case, people are driving or can't pull up the thing immediately.
Yeah, totally. Psychedelic Scientist on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter. I'm MGirn Neuro. You could probably just search Manesh on Twitter. You'll find me. Also on LinkedIn, Manesh Girn. If you want access to the paper, I do have a link to free access to enable free access to it. So
share that with us, Manesh, and we can put it in the show notes.
Definitely.
For people to be able to check out as well. That would be dope. So the Psychedelic Scientist on Instagram and YouTube, or MGirn Neuro on Twitter. And then we'll have a link to that paper as well. What's the title of that paper, Manesh?
So the title of the paper is A Complex Systems Perspective on Psychedelic Brain Action.
Oh, cool. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Manesh.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.